All right, welcome to the Essential Libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. We've been upping our podcast episodes lately, so get excited for more. I'm with the best contemporary American thinker on all forms of anarchism. That is Keith Preston of Attack the System, who is a self-identified anarcho-pluralist. Same with me. How are you doing, Keith?
I'm good.
Awesome. So I've been reading your book. There's been a lot of crazy events. I used to miss when the news and like the 90s was just one event and it's like, okay, read about that, move on. Now there's like 50 different things going on. But I actually had some questions in general and some questions on your book that I'd like to explore.
Okay.
Um, One is, as you know, as you've seen my posts, I am a fan of the late and, in my opinion, great General Lee. And I do like the Confederacy in the fact that it made things smaller. And I do appreciate his prediction, which was the same as the Anti-Federalists. Hey, this would become an empire who would antagonize the world. And he saw that even, before it was, even in the days of Lincoln. He's like, this is going to be something that's going to antagonize the world. Enters World War One, World War Two, then the end of the Cold War. It really happened. So I, or how would I go about as an anarchist who wants unity but also wants to explore ideas? How would I go about presenting? Because I did post that General Lee thing, presenting Lee in a positive light, but also maintaining support from maybe some left, like syndicalists, platformists, and comms. How do I not get them mad? Because I think you agree with me in that, or I could be wrong.
Well, when it comes to the Civil War, um, most people obviously are swayed by one or another version of the official narrative. Of course, the mainstream narrative is, well, the South wanted to secede in order to maintain slavery, and Lincoln came along with the Union forces and heroically ended slavery. I mean, that's the conventional narrative we get, from most of the media, the educational system. Now, in the South and in some more conservative circles, they present it somewhat differently. You still have some people that are, I guess you could call them Confederate loyalists. They call it the War of Northern Aggression. I'm from Virginia myself, so I grew up around people like that. But a more conventional view that you find in the South, and this is how it was taught when I was in elementary school, and I went to a private Christian elementary school in the '70s, which was very conservative. So that not a anything remotely approaching the leftism there. But they used to just present the Civil War as an unfortunate event where Americans killed Americans, and we shouldn't do that anymore,
Mm-hmm.
without really getting into any of the politics of it. And that's kind of how a lot of people in the South view it, even today. Older or more conservative people.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. Well,
See,
here's
here's how.
let me build
Okay.
on that because this is complicated. Like I grew up in a town called Lynchburg, Virginia, and Appomattox, Virginia, which is where the Civil War ended, where Grant worked out the terms of surrender with Lee. That's about 30 minutes from where I grew up. I used to go there on field trips as a kid in elementary school. So it's a very, I grew up very close to all that. But most people that I grew up around during that time period were not gung ho Southern nationalists saying the South's going to rise again, lost cause, all this kind of stuff. And they weren't white supremacists either. Like, isn't it too bad we didn't get to keep black folks as slaves? They didn't really
Mhm.
believe that. It was more just history. People that I grew up around viewed the Civil War history the way they view the history of the American Revolution. You have things like that in Virginia as well, like the founding of Jamestown and Williamsburg and all that kind of stuff. Mount Vernon, which was George Washington's home, and Monticello, that's in Charlottesville, that's Thomas Jefferson's home. So most people, in that cultural environment, just viewed this as historical stuff. It's not really that ideological. As far as the approaching this from an anarchist perspective, when the Civil War happened, there was an anarchist he was from Connecticut. His name was Lysander Spooner, and he's
Yes.
an important name in anarchist history. Um, And Lysander Spooner was an attorney who was an abolitionist. One of the things he specialized in was defending fugitive slaves and that kind of stuff. But his take on the Civil War was that the if the South wanted to remain in the Union, then they had to abolish slavery. Now, he argued that that slavery is unconstitutional based on
Hmm.
the actual political theory of the Constitution, and he was saying, well, if the South wants to maintain slavery, not only should they secede, they should be expelled. That was basically his view of the South. But at the same time, he supported the right of the South to secede, but he also favored slave rebellions, and he supported runaway slaves and the Underground Railroad and all of these kinds of things. So he was not a pro-slavery person. He was a radical for his time. He was an abolitionist. But so a lot of this history gets obscured. Um, and if you look at the what happened with the Civil War, when the South was defeated, what did the Union Army do next? Well, they continued the westward expansion. They went and they started attacking the Native American nations. So the idea that the Union Army was not racist or less racist than the South is silly. I mean, in those days, in the 19th century, racism was virulent in the United States. And the North was just as racist as the South, and they had no more use for Native Americans than they did for black slaves. Um, and what happened after the South was defeated is, and the Union consolidated its position as the Union continued the westward expansion and attacks on the Native American nations, and then the expansion into the Pacific and the conquest of Hawaii, and then the Philippines and the Philippine War. And as the United States continued to build this continental empire, that's what allowed the United States the ability to enter into World War One on behalf of the British. And that
Correct.
resulted in the total destruction of the Central Powers. That's why we don't have Austria-Hungary. That's why that we don't have the Ottomans anymore, and that's why we don't have the Wilhelmine Germany anymore. So the total destruction of the Central Powers created one disaster after another. Obviously, Versailles, which led to the rise of Nazism, is the most obvious
Hmm.
one. But then you also had, after the destruction of Germany in World War II, you had the Soviet occupation of half of Europe. All right, then in the Middle East, after the destruction of the Ottomans, what did you get then? Well, you got British and French imperialism, and then out of that, you saw the rise of Islamism and then Zionism, the creation of
Yeah,
Israel.
that's where we're at now.
So yeah, and we're dealing with all the consequences of that nowadays. So I mean, I think that there are probably very few people, if they really had a full understanding of the history of the 20th century, would say that who would not take back, who would not bring back the Ottomans or the Habsburgs or the Hohenzollerns, the royal dynasty of Germany. It would probably be kind of nice to have them back in compared to some of the stuff that came afterward, like Nazism, like Sovietism, like Zionism, like Islamism, like the
Mhm.
global American empire of today.
Hey, you leave mandatory Palestine alone. They didn't do nothing.
Yeah. But I guess I'll give you my take on it from listening. I grew up thinking like, okay, Lincoln was a great guy. He was basically like Bernie Sanders with a top hat, cared about everybody, and Grant was just a good dude who, and the people in the North were enlightened, and the only people raising that flag were rednecks around me who did have a bias, and they weren't even rednecks because they just drove quads and put in chew, and that's not really working on a farm. That's just kind of listening to country music. That I don't consider that an actual farmer because they're not growing anything or tending to animals. So it's kind of like your uh, redneck that want to be rednecks that are doing that. That I'm not a fan of. But then I got into ANCAP circles and I listened to a dude named Legalman, and basically what he said is that actually, well, what really happened was yes, it was over slavery was also over taxes. There was a lot of things, and the states voted to leave. And they didn't start rioting; they voted to leave. Then I saw things like Gangs of New York, where the Union soldiers just mowed people down. And I'm like, wait, I thought you told me Union with the good guys. And then on top of that, I learned, and I'm not saying it's right, but I learned like only the 1%, like only people like if it were today, only people like the Gates or the Zuckerberg, like the really rich people had multiple amounts of slaves. Like most people didn't even have one. So why would they go to war to fight over something they didn't have? Also, here's
Well,
another position.
admittedly, though, like you should read the letters that they wrote in defense of their secession. You should read their like stated reasons because all the official documents included things about like protecting slavery as an institution.
I get that. I'm not a fan of that. But I guess
Hold on.
I get I
So
get
like
to
so like if all the official documents at the founding of these states, like is the separation from the Union, include things that defend slavery, it's not about slavery, but the answer to that shouldn't be to erase that fact or pretend it's not there. It
so
should be to say that Lincoln said, quote, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. And in saying that, he's basically saying, I don't give a fuck about slavery. That's not the reason I'm doing this. I'm doing this to bring the Union to heel.
correct. And I'll even put one more point is because my dad maybe I didn't care before, and then my dad was a history guy, so in addition to the Arab-Israeli war, it made me watch Gone with the Wind, and then I started to slowly turn from like the Union's the hero to wait, maybe the Confederates did, and then eventually I came to the point where Legalman says this: the Civil War wasn't a civil war because even Stonewall Jackson did want to, I guess, destroy Washington, but aside from that, they weren't trying to take over Washington and win; they were trying to defend their state. And really, when I look back to all the bad events today, I feel it started with the Civil War, and I almost take the position, hey, a confederacy is better than a constitutional republic because it's agreed upon there. And if you get to a confederacy, then we can get to the suggestion in your book where you say, okay, we're all part of a confederacy. What do you want to do? Well, I want to do a Hoppian society over here. I want everything private. I want a gated community. Okay. I want to do a syndicalist society over here in this piece of the confederacy. Okay. I want to do and prim stand. We don't like, your cell phones are bad. They give EMF. Okay. Sounds, I want to do, oh, oops. I want to do this or that or the other. Um, so that's kind of my thing I've been thinking about is if Lee was right about, this crazy empire popping up, which I want to even show left libertarians, hey, maybe he had a point in your meta secessionist idea or pan meta secessionist. I think people need to hear it, go back and look at these arguments, and then we need to. I don't care if Trump's on the ballot or not. I'm so far beyond that point. I don't care who's on the ballot. I just want to pull states out of the union somehow. It's even you could put Ron Paul on the ballot, and people could all write him in, and I'd be like, no, let's just like states.
See,
like this state.
My deal is my whole deal, and obviously I'm interested in your response, Keith. I don't think any amount of electoralism or any official processes are going to save anything at this point, and I don't think fracturing the U.S. into smaller states would do anything but like make their concentrated power vis-a-vis other nations smaller at this point. And like with the rise up of BRICS, that's basically just asking for hostile takeovers. What I push for is a mindset of global insurrection and real insurrection, not the stupid tantrum those feds threw at January 6th, but like a real insurrectionary mindset of global, international, like semi-intersectional fucking, insurrectionary working men's kind of universalism that like gets to every single country so that every single country can start building their like small anarchist circles so that those small anarchist circles could grow into something bigger in their home territory, or be violently crushed by the state so that the state can prove that it doesn't value freedom, it just values its own control mechanisms.
Sorry, there's a lot there.
Yeah, well, I think when we're talking about the Civil War, the way to frame that is that it was a war between two tyrannical states. It's
Yes.
not either side were the good guys. you had the South that was a slaveocracy. I mean, it was a quasi feudal system that was essentially a slaveocracy. And the South established its position largely through the ethnic cleansing of the Native Americans, originally through the Trail of Tears and all of that. And then the North was the same thing. I mean, the North, the real issue was what kind of slavery was the American ruling class going to have? Were they going to have Northern industrial wage slavery or Southern agrarian chattel slavery? And which type was going to be expanded into the Western territories? That was a big part of it. That's one of the things that really that really was a major cause of the war. Which model was going to be the model that was going to be dominant in the westward expansion? But both sides were interested in expanding westward and exterminating the Native American nations. It's just that the North got there first. The South also wanted to expand into Latin America and the Caribbean and create an empire, slave empire of its own there. So it's not like either one of these teams were good guys. I mean, this was a heel versus heel match, as they say in pro wrestling. So I think that's the way to frame it. So the issue is, when it comes to conventional politics today, is that in many ways the ruling class of the United States nowadays tends to use the South or the Confederate legacy or whatever as a scapegoat. Where
whipping boy.
Yeah, exactly. Which in many ways simply masks the very similar forms of oppression that existed in the history of the United States in its entirety, and in the history of the northern region. I think we need to get away from that. I think that taking that rhetorical tool away from the ruling class is really the way to address the issue of the Civil War. It's not that the South were good guys. It's not that we want to revive the Confederacy or anything like that. That's kind of off the wall.
Fuck the Neo-Confederates. Fuck the Neo-Confederates.
Well, here's one thing. I'd want to. Okay, so in your book, to have different societies, what I'd want to do, I wouldn't call it a Neo-Confederate, but I looked at here's what a constitutional republic is, which we don't have anymore. It's gone. As far as I'm concerned, it was gone when people voted to leave. So we don't have that. So what we need to do now is get states maybe to agree based on some kind of okay, we all agree, Texas and Arkansas agree, hey, we need to leave. Okay, let's leave. Okay, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, that we need to leave, and start pushing. We do, in my opinion, need to push for secession. Also in your book, you do say we need some type of national defense because China and Russia and some world powers and BRICS might not go anarchist at the same time. I know Jeremy has made fun of me for saying this, and I'm okay with saying it, though. We still have things like the Boogaloo Boys or Antifa, which I'm not going to say could invade Russia and win, but I think it could prevent.
When have I made fun of you for saying we should get with the Boog and Antifa?
No. I said the Boog and Antifa could beat Russia, which actually probably is not factually incorrect. But I'm curious. In your book, you talk about it. How do you see if America gets closer and closer to anarchism, real anarchism, not Javier Milei? How do you see, or what do you see? Because I could easily say, Rothbardian national defense, we just get private defense, but what do you see as a defense if we go anarchist before, say, China and Russia? I'm curious.
On the attackthesystem.com website, there is an essay that I wrote about over 20 years ago called Anarchist National Defense and Foreign Policy. And I haven't actually gone back and reread it for a long time, so I don't know if I would stand by every word of it now or not. But I wrote that back in the early 2000s. And in that, I outlined sort of a general paradigm for what anarchist national defense would look like. And of course, whenever anyone has encountered that essay, you have some anarchists to say, well, anarchists don't believe in nations, or anarchists don't believe in armies or whatever. It could be, but if you have a territory somewhere where anarchists are the largest political group, there still might be people who want to attack you. So what I outlined in that is sort of a paradigm for what anarchist national defense, or defense of a stateless territory, or whatever you want to call it, would look like. And I showed that essay to a friend of mine recently, who's something of a historian, and he said it reminded him of the Byzantium theme system. So I didn't even know what that was. I had to go back and look that up a bit. I think that there's a lot of historical prototypes of societies that didn't have overarching authoritarian state systems that were able to effectively ward off invaders. An example from classical antiquity was when the Greeks effectively repelled the Persian Empire. Now, Greece was just a collection of about 1,100 cities. It wasn't really a state in the modern sense. I mean, it wasn't anarchy either. I mean, they had slaves and stuff like that, so it wasn't anarchy. But it wasn't an overarching state system, and certainly not even by ancient standards. It wasn't an ancient state. But when they were threatened by the Persian Empire, they were able to effectively repel the Persian Empire in spite of not having a big central government. During the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire of Central Europe was able to ward off invaders on a number of occasions from Turkey and places like that. And while that was technically a feudal monarchy, it was a very and it was a very fractured and disorganized feudal monarchy. It was really just a collection of hundreds of principalities that were barely strung together by an emperor who had no power.
Would you call that? That sounds like anarcho-monarchism. Funny enough,
Yeah.
Debating is that a real thing? And it sounds ridiculous. I get it. I know people like Kareem lost it. I have a long time ago, but Gaelic Ireland, I think Gaelic Ireland was legitimately anarchist, from what I understood. They just had like elders, if you consider elders like a government, which I kind of don't. I kind of consider that like maybe either anarchy or cryptarchy, like you're talking about. I think Gaelic Ireland did a very good job in defending until the British actually took the Druids over, and that's kind of one thing people press me about is like, well, okay, how would national defense? And then I looked at Robert Murphy, who's an Austrian economist, and he said like, okay, you'd have insurance companies giving people like, okay, if you get hit by, I guess like, hey, honey, I got my Spetsnaz insurance, we're good to go. If I get attacked, or I got my like whatever the Chinese special forces are insurance or something, call it a quirky name. And then you'd hire private defense. Then I guess, other people would come up with different ideas. The issue I have, or the issue I was trying to figure out is, how do you prevent, I guess, that national defense, or I shouldn't call it national defense. We'd call it like maybe decentralized defense among regions or states or confederacies, from not losing to bigger powers. Like, because a lot of people argue, well, we still need a professional army. You still want a professional army, and B, how do you prevent them from? I don't like countries where militaries just take over. So how do you prevent that? Sorry, I haven't read your essay on Attack the System on that, so maybe I need to before asking these.
Well, I think a big part of that would be the cultural foundation of the society in question.
Mm-hmm.
In a society where it was a general popular consensus, a cultural consensus, where the state is a bad thing and we shouldn't have one, and a state run by the military is a really bad thing, and we shouldn't go in that direction. That is a barrier to the formation of a state system. For instance, back in the, I don't know if I mentioned this the last time I was on your program or not. I know I was talking about this somewhere recently. In the Renaissance, there was a writer named Etienne de Bataille. He was a Frenchman, and he wrote an essay called Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. And he was arguing that the way that states, rulers, whatever, he lived in a time when absolute monarchies were on the rise. The way that rulers get their power is that people simply acquiesce to them. And if people, in large enough numbers, simply withdrew consent to being ruled, the ruler collapses. The ruler no longer has any power. And Carl Schmitt, he was a legal theorist in the 20th century, anything but an anarchist. But he said that the foundation of any state is acclamation. And what he meant by that is that a state has legitimacy and maintains power to the degree that it is able to receive the acclamation of its subjects. And if a state can lose legitimacy just through becoming unpopular and falling apart, and people withdraw consent, they withdraw acquiescence. And we've seen examples of that, for instance, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the late 80s, early 90s. That was a very dramatic example of that. The overthrow of President Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines in 1986 is another example. So I think that ultimately, for the prevention of the formation of a new state system, there would have to be a shared cultural or social consensus against the creation of a state. Just like in the United States today, for example, we have this established tradition of republicanism, meaning most people think a monarchy is a bad idea. So, I mean, as somebody who ran for president as a Democrat or Republican and said, what we need is a monarchy, they'd be laughed out of court because, that's just so antithetical to American history.
The meme would be King insert name.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, they'd probably be like, yeah, that's correct. But we do have one. Larry Fink of BlackRock actually owns it. Like,
well, we have a lot of figures that function as de facto, monarchs. So
we have a monarch, Keith. His name's Bibi Netanyahu, and he buys American politicians.
This isn't a monarchy. If anything, it's an oligarchy. Go ahead.
Yeah. Or another example is separation of church and state. In the United States, it's a pretty well-established tradition that we have church-state separation. And if somebody came along in the United States and said, we really need something like the Church of England, and which they still have in Britain, by the way.
In name only, just gonna say that because the separation of church and state is so weak. If you have to swear allegiance to Israel, or if you have to if you basically have to swear on a Bible or have a religion, if there has never been an atheist president, if all this stuff, I mean the state has never been separate from the church. It just draws this imaginary distinction.
Well, there's a degree of separation that you wouldn't have found, say, in a medieval.
Yeah. Aesthetically, at least.
And it's if somewhere where religion and state is really blended is somewhere like Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So
actual theocracies.
Yeah. So there is a distinction. But let's say if somebody came along today and said, in the United States, we should have a theocracy like Saudi Arabia, there might be a tiny minority of fringe people who want to have that. But most people would think, well, that's a little, going a little overboard. So the point is, you have a cultural consensus against some of these kinds of things. If we had people today that said, we should bring back slavery, that wouldn't sell either, because there's a shared cultural consensus that slavery was a bad thing. And it's good that we don't have it anymore. So, the degree to which people consent to and legitimize a particular set of social structures matters a great deal. And I think ultimately that would have to be the primary barrier to the creation of a new state system. That is, most people just don't believe in that. Now, there can be, institutional safeguards or whatever against that. But I think that without this cultural consensus, you're really not going to get anywhere.
People have to want it, or they're going to reject it, just like they rejected the previous system. And that's one of the things, I constantly make the case that we got to get the cultural foundation laid first. And we've got to do that by proving that we can interact and network on our own and do all of who would build the X? We would, motherfuckers. We would, and we're going to prove it, and we're going to prove it in such a profound and simple way that the state will actually actively have to try to crush us. And when the state is crushing grandma for, selling preserves without a license, it's going to be very obvious where the tyranny is. Plus, all of this combined with the fact that, the vast majority of people hate the system in one way or another, if you give them an alternative and say, that this is what we could do instead of this, they'll at the very least be interested to see how it goes. And then it's showtime. We show them how it goes. we prove that it can work, because otherwise, without the cultural consensus, and especially doing that on a global level, reaching out to brothers in Syria, Yemen, whatever, Russia, China, anywhere we can get our hands on, like, we need to like get the message out, and we need to do it in a way that like is uncompromised and uncompromising and allows for a plurality. And without doing that, like, we are doomed to a small uprising of a few people history will call insane and then dead, because
Right.
those people died doing the insane proposition of trying to overthrow the government when it still has the common person on a leash.
Yeah, and actually, I'm one interesting question, because I read I really like the chapter why I'm an anarcho pluralist, because I agree there's some things I don't care about, which are actually the issues that you mentioned, the three issues. But you said you want to secede down to a local level, not necessarily an individual level. I know Murray Rothbard said, like, hey, we should get secession down to the individual, and there might be some. I haven't read Sterner, but my understanding of Sterner is like, individual level, and also there's like the Tucker individualist types there too. uh I'd be curious, like, okay, we got the Hoppian Society, we got this, and we're all fundamentally individuals. How do you see a need to keep secession down to the local level, or for some people could it go down to the, or would it go down to the individual level? Like, what if somebody, a Sterner or a Tucker guy, says, "Okay, hey, I don't want to be part of any of these societies. I'm my own guy. I'm seceding down to the level of individual." Would you say that's good,
Yeah.
or
Well, there's a whole theoretical framework of anarchism that's based on that. That's panarchism. That, the idea of panarchism was developed in the 19th century by, I think, Paul Emile Depew was really the person that came up with the term. And then this idea has since been promoted by some other anarchists. There was Max Natlau, he was an anarcho-communist, but he was a historian of anarchism. And John Zuba, who's still alive, was a big proponent of this. I think he's probably in his 90s now. And also, there's a Swiss Italian anarchist now named Gianpiero De Bellis, who operates a website called panarchy.org. And they have this, all of these thinkers I just described and others like them have this idea of anarchism where you can basically secede personally without seceding territorially. And what that means is that governmental systems would be entirely voluntary organizations, like clubs,
Subscription services.
yeah, or sports teams or something, or bowling leagues or whatever. Yeah, it's meaning that if you want to join, one team or whatever, you can do that. You can leave one team and join the other. So, like a friend of mine that writes for us at Attack the System, Nikki Reed, she says that with panarchism, you could have 20 countries in the same apartment building because everybody belongs to a different country. So, some of this gets really abstract and it sounds really complicated on the surface. But there is a theoretical model for that called panarchism, and other terms for it are polyarchy. A personarchy is another term that's been used for this. Personal law is another term. So yeah, ultimately, I'd say ideally you would have individual secession, where panarchism or polyarchy or personarchy would be the theoretical framework in which this takes place. Now, localism might be a pragmatic step towards that particular end, but it's not necessarily an end unto itself.
okay, yeah, that makes sense to me, and I'll look into a lot of these things. And I also see you mentioned the Reds and the Primies. Are the Primies anarcho primitivists and the Reds ancoms, or I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
the premies, yeah, that's a slang term for the anarcho primitivists, and
Yeah.
the Reds are the anarcho communists.
Okay. And just say, if you're watching this, John Zerzan, I still like you. You're a cool dude. I got to get Zerzan. We had Zerzan on, actually. He's very, very cool, because I wanted to show people, because there are people like in ANCOM and ANCAP circles, like, oh my God, primitivists want to pull the plug on grandma, and they all want us to like eat, berries and chop wood with our hands or something. Like, dude, please stop. Like,
Well,
let me
and
get
of course, those same people fucking hate me because, like, I consistently attack technology. I consistently attack the way that it's developing and being used, and I unironically and like without reservations will quote Kaczynski on a variety of things because fuck anyone who doesn't like his philosophy at the least. He had very good points, and people should have listened to a lot of what he had to say. And like the thing with like people who attack anarcho-primitivists is that they're trying to preserve the current system in some form. They don't care. Like ultimately, they don't care about what the primitivists have to say. They just don't like the fact that they might interfere with their Netflix subscription or some other aspect of convenience in fucking society that people like, oh no, my Pornhub's gonna go away. I fucking fuck you, shitbag. I'll kill you.
Okay. And to be fair, yes, I agree with my
In
big thing.
Minecraft.
Yeah.
1v1 man Minecraft is what I meant to say for Patreon's sake.
Oh
Anyway,
God.
go ahead.
All right. Okay, fine. We do Minecraft. And my big thing is like solar punk, get these guys to talk to each other, like mutualism. I want to get these, ancoms and anarchists to talk to each other. In your book, you did talk about ANCAPs and all this stuff, the Reds, the Primies, and everything. And I was just curious. I didn't see much mention of agorism or Samuel Konkin, and I'd be curious just before we get into Yemen to hear what are your thoughts on Samuel Konkin. And then me and Jeremy have debated: was Rothbard right, take a political route, or was Konkin right, take a completely black market or gray market route?
Yeah,
You know,
I knew Sam Conkin only
you did?
very casually. Yeah, only very casually though, not well. He wasn't like a good friend or anything.
That'd be
But
wild.
I knew him before he passed away. But yeah, his ideas on counter economics I always thought were really interesting. In fact, Sam created his own model of the left right political spectrum at one point. And he created this really elaborate chart indicating who's on the left or who's on the right or whatever. And it was published in some libertarian zine back around, I'd say 1979 or 80. You may still be able to find this chart he created online. I think I have it somewhere. If I can find it, I'll send it to you. But he created this really elaborate chart where he was saying, well, the true right, of course, because he considered himself to be a left libertarian. So he said the real right is whoever is closest to power. So he was saying, well, okay, the actual state is the right, and then he talked about different types of state. He was writing during the Cold War, so you've got the Western style states, and then you've got the communist states and all of that. And then how right someone is how close they were to power. So he was saying that like neocons, which weren't in power in the 70s, but were working their way into power, they're like the next step down underneath the state or in the Eastern world, or then there's out of power communists and fascists who are super statists but not quite in control of the state. And then he had all the different types of socialism and anarchism and libertarianism, and he had this really elaborate level of gradation, and he would even break down every individual group. Well, the LA chapter of the LP, well, they're a little more statist than the San Francisco chapter, so they're a little to the right, whereas the San Francisco chapter is a little to the left, and then the Libertarian Party of whatever Outer Mongolia, well, they're more anarchistic, and then he would say, well, you have pseudo anarchists, like syndicalists, and he was called them pseudo anarchists. But you also have anarcho syndicalists who are more anarchists than syndicalists. So yeah, Sam was an interesting guy to be sure.
So,
And,
yeah,
and
that's
like
cool.
and like part of the reason he was like that is because he saw the rise of like capital power, and that's a thing that a lot of people in alleged libertarian circles need to get the cock out of their throat about, because like the like capital power, the funding, the models that create the actual basis for power is not communism in like any sense. Even in alleged communist countries, they admitted they employed state capitalist power. And Lenin said that it wasn't functionally different under him than it was like under Marxist Leninism
Yeah.
than it was under the state capitalists. Just we're in control now. And so when people don't recognize that, when people don't recognize that, like, fundamentally power has always been capital, and that really left power has never like been attempted in a pure sense. They've always been like mixed economies that were heavily still influenced by capital and never truly work our own means of production. The auth right has always been the auth model. So if he made this chart that says, and I read about that too, Wendy McElroy wrote a 3-part article series for Agorist Nexus where she went over this mentality that he had, and what differentiates agorism from anarcho-capitalism. And like she went over his particular like spectrum and application thereof, and I think it's a valuable thing to think about. I personally I think there is a possibility for an auth left, but like I think that the way that it's been attempted in the past has always been designed to appease some aspect of capital, and that's why like every alleged communist country turned into a capitalist hellhole in the same way that Emma Goldman said it, in the same way that Bakunin said it would happen, and in the same way that fucking the Mao Zedong literally said, "I'll use state capitalism to get there," and nobody reads this shit. They just prefer thinking that anything that I don't like is communism, and when the government does stuff, it's socialism, and when the government does even more stuff, it's even more socialisty. It's fucking asinine and nuance free.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say about that. I think one issue is that a lot of self-identified anarchists have a too limited definition of what the state is. Like I would say that the state is not just the political government, the politicians and bureaucratic functionaries. The state is the whole ruling class apparatus. And
Banks, corporations, media.
banks, corporations, media, universities. William Domhoff has this theory of the 4 networks. And he was saying that in societies, you've got the political elite, you've got the economic elite, you've got the ideological elite, and those are the institutions that disseminate the ideology and the values that are dominant in the society. In the Middle Ages, it would have been the Catholic Church. Nowadays, it's the media and the educational system. And then you've got the military as well. I would say that the state proper, the ruling class proper, the power elite. I suppose you could use those terms separately or interchangeably, but the state is the entire spectrum of the ruling class, and then the ruling class itself is layered. You have, in local cities, you have oligarchs who are, like Donald Trump, for example, in New York, he was a real estate oligarch. It's in the town I grew up in, there was a clerical oligarch, a family that owned a big mega church, and pretty much had as much power as they wanted over the town. And so there's all different levels of this. A good way to look at it is like in the Middle Ages, you had the state, the monarchy, the king, his ministers. You also had the military, the king's knights. Yeah. You also had the church. You also had the feudal aristocracy, and then that was layered between the biggest land barons and the smaller ones. And modern societies have their own parallels to all of those things as well. So I think a lot of anarchists kind of miss the boat when it comes to trying to critique how systems and institutions work, because they're usually focused in on one little fairly narrow angle. And I think they end up missing a lot of things. And as far as the whole socialism, capitalism thing, if you define socialism as the government doing stuff, well, obviously we already have plenty of socialism. Now, that's not really the historic meaning of socialism.
Yep.
But if you define socialism, well, government does stuff. Well, government in our society is half the economy. So, of course, we have socialism in that sense. If you define capitalism as simply people making money, well, we've obviously got a lot of that too. So our system, and most modern countries are the same way. Most modern countries are, a mixture of what some people think is socialism and what some people think is capitalism. We've got plenty of government and plenty of state involvement, and we've also got plenty of private making as well. And so a lot of folks, I think, really waste too much time arguing about the relative merits of socialism and capitalism when this kind of system we have, I call it plutocratic imperial statism, because we have a state, obviously, but it's also a plutocratic state where you have elite private interests that are making lots of money off of it. And it's imperialistic as well. Imperialism is built into that system. Um, and then now, when it comes to the more radical philosophies, if you define capitalism, if you're like a hardcore ANCAP who says that capitalism is merely total laissez faire, then obviously we're light years away from that. And if you're a Marxist Leninist who says, well, socialism is a centrally planned economy where the means of production are nationalized and the abolition of wage labor and commodification and the law of value and distribute resources according to need. Well, obviously, that's not our system either. And then if you're a libertarian socialist or an anarcho-syndicalist who says, well, worker control of the means of production, that's real socialism. Well, we're light years from that too. So these radical philosophies, we don't practice any of them in modern societies. They're all on the margins. People who believe in and advocate for all of those viewpoints are very much on the margins.
Heterodox.
And we have, and our actual system is a whole lot of government involvement and a whole lot of private profiteering as well. So, so plutocratic statism is really the kind of system that we have.
I agree with that. But I've made this argument. Some people actually pretty shocked with it. Then I'll jump into the South African trial and then Yemen. But after reading Conquest for Bread, which was probably the last book I read as like an ANCAP man and ANCAP stand, and I found I typed in one day, I'm like, Jeremy says anarcho pluralism or pan, and I typed in, and I'm like, who's Keith Presenton? Oh, he has a website, Attack the System. What's an anarcho pluralist? Oh, I think I'm that. But after looking at Conquest for Bread, looking at some of Errico Malatesta's arguments and looking at some of Bakunin's arguments, although I haven't read Bakunin, Jeremy has.
Statism and Anarchy is a great book. You'll find out about how he was kicked out of the Marxist Union because he was like actually a radical and actually wanted a different system rather than just state capitalism plus. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, I said this to Jeremy and other people, and then they're like, wow, because Karl Marx never effectively, and none of anyone who's read Karl Marx has effectively got past the transition period. It's kind of crazy to think somebody would give up power anyway, even from what we saw with the 2020 craziness. Is it fair to say Karl Marx, since he never established a decentralized commune that was based on communal ownership or communal cooperation, can I say he's not a communist at all? Is that fair? Yeah. The only real communists were Kropotkin, Bakunin, Malatesta, and Emma Goldman, because they understood it needs to be community-based, not state transition, and then magically a commune appears and we're all good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, Marx was really more like an economic historian and a theorist of capitalism. I mean, in all of his writings, there's maybe half a dozen sentences on what communism in practice would actually look like. We do know from his correspondence with his associates, Engels and others, and just the general tenor of his movement, that the Marx and his associates held to a model of revolution like the French Revolution. They were within that tradition. It's all about seizing power and vanquishing your enemies and establishing socialism. And it's clear that they advocated nationalizing the means of production. They said so. That's not just guesswork. They said so. There are disputes among Marx scholars as far as whether something like the Soviet Union is really Marxism. There are plenty of people who identify as Marxists who say, well, that's not really what Marx had in mind. I used to hold more to that view when I was younger, but as I've studied Marxism more over time, I tend to agree more with Murray Bookchin. Murray Bookchin said once that, that the Soviet Union and Maoist China are really the logical outcome of Marxism in practice, because if you think the state should run the entire economy, then, well, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a totalitarian state. And certainly, Marx's most impassioned followers believe that the Soviet Union was actual Marxism. It's like I know communists, I know Western communists who were serious communists who believe that. They say, yeah, of course the Soviet Union was socialist, and they'll say it wasn't perfect, it had its flaws, but it was still socialism. For example, Caleb Maupin he's a journalist from Russia Today. He makes this argument, and I think the way he presents Marxism, I think, is accurate in the historical context. It's these folks who say, well, no, Marx was actually a social democrat. If he were here today, he'd be a Bernie Sanders supporter or something. That's not.
No, I don't believe that. I guess what I think is this: to put it in real simple, like practical terms, like Marx is like, oh, okay, we'll have the state magically, control everything, and then somehow they'll give up power, and you'll have this communal utopia. Where to me, I think if you actually want communism, you do what you just do what Penny Rumbard from Crassus do. I have an open door policy. Come on in. You trade some art for some food, and you can stay as long as you like. Or even more contemporary, like Insanity is Free has Anarchy House. They say come in, contribute with whatever you can, and then we'll have that system. So to me, that's more communism than saying, oh, we're going to centralize the means of production. Instead of doing that, you just say, hey, we all like, I don't know, we all like the Amish. We all want a community based on faith. Okay, you like Jesus, you like Jesus, you like Jesus, and you're looking at your phone too much. So what we're going to do is limit the technology. We're all going to get together. We're all going to have communal ownership, and we're all going to work towards this goal. And we're going to all have public and personal property, and personal property is what you can use readily available, and public property is the way my friend Lizard Jesus described it is if you want an authentic communist society, you have personal property that's your own use that you need for daily living and doing your business and all that fun stuff, and then you want to also have goods that, like the library, you can take a book and then check out a book. You do that with tools. You do that with everything else. That to me is real communism, or what Eric Malatesta described as intelligent decentralization. Again, I was more on the Rothbard side. I still am more on the capitalist Rothbard side. Make a bunch of money, get a bunch of Bitcoin. But I'm slowly looking at the left side. So hopefully my analysis is kind of okay, even though I'm not like per se a historian or a philosopher.
Well, I'm glad, I'm glad we've improved, because you made your entire statements today without any AI. So
yes, I had a guest on who wanted to utilize AI, and I said, okay, we will. I use AI for descriptions on YouTube and tags, but that's it.
Well, as far as examples of anarcho-communism in real life, there's a place not far from where I live. It's in Louisa County, Virginia, called Twin Oaks. You can probably find information about it on YouTube. I know there's stuff about it on the internet, but it's an intentional community, and it's been in existence for over 50 years. And at any one time, they'll have maybe 100 or so, maybe 150 people living there. And it's a self-sustained community where it's an income-sharing community, and they also share in the work, and they make things that they sell and stuff like that on the outside. So it's not really communism proper, but it is close to being a private property-less society, because all property there is owned as a collective, except for like your toothbrush and stuff like that. So I think anarcho-communism is really something like Twin Oaks. And theoretically, you could have a mass society with that model of organization. I mean, you could have a country that had a million different versions of Twin Oaks as its dominant economic model. But I think that's what communism would actually look like, or anarcho-communism. And I think that's what the original anarcho-communists more or less envisioned. One thing about them that you have to remember is that the anarcho-communists, the early ones, came mostly from what were essentially feudal societies. And they were used to observing the communal traditions among the peasant villages and that kind of stuff in Russia and Spain and Italy and these places. The individualist anarchists tended to come from places like Germany and England and America, which were much more industrially advanced, bourgeois commercial societies. In fact, Kropotkin himself noticed that. He said that it was interesting that individualist anarchism was more popular in these heavily commercial societies, whereas communist anarchism was more popular in these agrarian, basically still feudal societies.
Okay.
Yeah, well, like Kropotkin literally wrote a book on mutual aid, and he cited that anarchism would be the natural, like, not survival of the fittest and fucking fuck, what's the term of it? It's like peace through strength or something like that, not like, the strongest survive, but it's like the
Selection.
creatures that are like the best, suited to mutual aid, to like serving each other, like
Well, what
through a
Kropotkin,
Darwinian lens.
what Kropotkin
Go
was
ahead.
arguing was um, Darwin's theory of natural selection, when it was developed, was widely misinterpreted by a lot of people,
Yes.
probably deliberately in some instances. There's actually a really interesting book on that. It's a work in intellectual history about the history of Darwinian thought. It's by Peter Bowler. But he talks about this. He talks about what natural selection actually is and then how it's been misused and misinterpreted. But you had the so-called social Darwinists, and you had a particularly crude or extreme form of social Darwinist who said, well, social Darwinism is just survival of the fittest because that's natural selection, And Kropotkin actually argued against that, saying that, well, no, adaptability is the essence of natural selection. So whoever is most adaptable is who survives in nature. It's not just about carrying the biggest club. Well, and an illustration of what I mean is that in nature, say in natural selection in nature would be where it's the animal that is most adaptable might actually be a smaller animal that is capable of hiding away from predators.
Hell,
Where
a microbe.
yeah, yeah. Whereas a larger animal that's aggressive and predatory, they may be more likely to go extinct because they're always going around and attacking other animals, and so they're going to get killed off. Their species is going to get killed off in the long run. So that's actual natural selection. So natural selection is not just, well, you better go off and kill all your enemies before they get to you. And
I'm an alpha. I'm an alpha, and you need to buy my products and subscribe to my podcast. If you don't, you're a beta little bitch.
Yeah, no, I think there are members of the ruling class that took Darwin's thing and wanted to mix it with Malthusian concepts. They're like, hey, okay, I'm on top, so everybody who doesn't agree with this, or everybody who isn't this idea, or this, or whatever,
yeah,
get rid
yeah.
of that.
Well, they
My
still do. You,
question,
you still you still have a lot of that among the ruling class.
yeah,
Yeah,
and we still do. Um, Interestingly enough, I've listened to like I looked at that critique of Dugan. I looked at the critique of some Confucians and some things and like Chinese systems, but I guess my argument would be this: in America, Canada, maybe parts of Poland and other stuff. Yes, I've seen like anarcho-capitalism. Like I'm going to go out. It's very individualist oriented. Competition works, but if you listen to Dugan, one thing I see that is rooted in the culture, not that I like his ideas, but one thing's they said, oh, don't you want a job and a family and this, like very American, like individualist thinking. He's like, no, that's not. And they're very centered around like the Kremlin or this and this is the Eurasian thing. So to me, I would make, and a lot of people make a good argument. Even statists make a good argument. They're like, Kareem, you can't expect everybody to read Hoppe and Rothbard and the NAP. And for a long time, like, no, 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 you can. And even people say, like, the way the world peace is making all ANCAP. And I said, well, ANCAP will work in more individual. You're a sociologist. So I think one thing I found in sociology is very interesting. There's I cultures, which are very like individualist oriented. I'm going to get to the top. Like, I'm a boss. I'm going to get to I'm going to build my own business or do whatever. Like, watch out, Bezos, Elon Musk. I'm going to be the top without government help. I'm going to be the top, like very individual. And I have that individualist mentality. Like, I'm always competing. Um, and then there's also cultures that are we cultures. If I go to the Middle East, everybody's like the guy who would sell me falafel or whatever is interested in like, how's your grandma? How's your uncle? Things like that. Here, they don't care. Walmart. They're just like, I know this sounds weird, but I guess what I would say, or my question to you, and then we can get into topic is, sorry, I know I said that before. I cultures would be better off with individualist anarchism, maybe mutualism, maybe looking at the works of Murray Rothbard. That works. But if you go to Asia, if you go, like, if I were to try and convert Dugan to anarchism, I would hand him Conquest for Bread and Anarchy in the State. because those are more we cultures. They're more centered around we or the collective, or hey, we're all around the Kremlin, we're all around Beijing, or we're all around. Confucius was very strong on like a lot of people in America are like, hey, I get to move out. I don't ever want to see my parents again. Where like Confucius is like, bro, you gotta like hang out, because they're like a little bit old. Like, we need the family should have this place, the person should have this place. That to me is a we culture. Does that
Yeah,
make
they
sense?
call that the Chinese call that filial piety. That's their term for it.
Okay.
But yeah, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, there are different models of anarchism that would certainly work better for different cultures, and these distinctions that you've identified are really important. The theories behind that, the sociological theories, can get really complicated. For example, I don't know if you're aware of Hofstede's cultural dimensions. There was a social theorist named Hofstede, and he actually evaluated different kinds of cultures and created all these cultural models for how different cultures function. And interestingly, they teach this stuff in business schools nowadays because as more and more businesses are involved in international commerce, where they have overseas holdings and that kind of stuff, you have to know how to deal with other cultures. So if let's say you're a manager for a company that has a lot of overseas holdings, they may actually train you. Like if they're going to relocate you to be a manager in say Indonesia, they may tell you, well, remember now you're going to be in Islamic culture. You got to do things the Islamic way, or you're going to be in a more collectivist culture. You got to do things in a more collectivist way. Which includes things that means you have to restrain from doing things that would be okay in the West, but wouldn't fly in other places. So yeah, that's certainly true. I think that's why all these different models of anarchism are so important, is because
Yeah.
you have all the different. We've talked about the different religious models of anarchism. You've got Christian anarchism and Buddhist and Islamic and Jewish, and you can break those down into categories as well. But different types of anarchism would be more popular in different types of societies. Individualist anarchism, I think, would be primarily popular in these historic Anglo-Protestant cultures, which tend to be the most individualistic, like England and Canada and America and Australia and places like that. Whereas anarcho-communism, I think, would be much more salient to perhaps Russia, China, some Middle Eastern cultures.
I got a plan to stop the conflict. I got a plan to. Well, I was going to get into the trial, but I got a plan to stop the conflict, Keith. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get 200,000 copies of Anarchy by Errico Malatesta, a bunch of Conquest for Bread. And honestly, I really believe this. If you went to the Israeli kibbutzes and Hezbollah and be like, okay, stop fighting, please have a ceasefire for 2 months, read Conquest for Bread. Maybe, just maybe, they're like, wait, this is a bad system. All right, here's Aristatan. Here, we're going to set up kibbutzes here. We're going to set up Hezbollah villages here, and we're going to chill out. I know that sounds ridiculous, and have some trade between us. I know that sounds ridiculous, but like if I went to any Middle Eastern country and I'm like, salam alaikum, all that stuff, and I'm like, oh, he's a but then I tried to push Murray Rothbard ideas. They're like, Kareem, this is extremely individualistic. We don't do that. But if I pushed Kropotkin's ideas and then integrated into Islamic or Jewish faith, they're like, wow, that's kind of cool. That's communal. That will work. I know what I said sounds ridiculous. You can tell me if it sounds ridiculous. And go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's a good long-term plan.
All I was going to say before that was just like, this is a problem that a lot of anarchists have, is trying to act like their one preferred school would be the preferred school everywhere or else. I had this debate like a couple years ago on, I think it was the Burning Boots podcast, and like this fucking guy was trying to insist that communal property isn't even possible, and it also shouldn't be defended. And he was trying to say this because the only type of property ownership that could be legitimate is the individual ownership and claim to a piece of land. And I'm like, so what if a bunch of individuals get together and decide that the land is going to be used in a given way? And would that be protectable, or is that somehow anti-property rights? And he didn't have a good answer for that. And this is the kind of mentality that a lot of these people have: is my way or I'm going to force my way. That's the reason a lot of these people are copter cucks. That's the reason a lot of these people love their Augusto Pinochet fucking masturbatory bullshit. It's the reason a lot of these people love their, and on the opposite side, the reason a lot of commies love the sort of pro tanky bullshit, where they're going to excuse certain state actions as long as those are our people's corporations, etc. And when you get to this mentality of it, like, my framework is the framework, and any framework that is competitive has to be crushed, it ceases to be anarchy, because you are then trying to impose your will on other people. So unless you're going to allow for a pluralism, unless you're going to allow for all the sorts and varieties and sort of different pockets of different sorts around the world, unless you are going to allow for people to do what they want and determine their own destiny, it's going to require the establishment of a central power in order to say what the right way is and then force that onto people. And you're just going to end up with a state again. So it's the kind of thing where, for instance, AI Boy the other day wanted to pretend that the only possible way was, capitalism, and that was also the only possible way to do freedom. And he was totally willing to excuse whatever dictatorship happened to crop up, including Pinochet, in defense of that dumb mentality. And that's the kind of person we need to make very clear we are not affiliated with. Because if we don't, we are fucked. We cannot get global anarchy. We cannot foment our cultural foundation if our cultural foundation is do what I fucking tell you or I'll kill you.
No, I don't agree with that. And but I will allow people on the podcast, as long as they're not like outright calling for.
Sure,
I'll
I'm
say,
just
okay,
being a cunt.
yeah, I know.
Well, yeah, the fixation that some of these, ANCAP adjacent people have with Pinochet is really bizarre, because I mean, all Pinochet was just an American puppet. I mean, like, if you're somebody that finds something admirable about fascism, I suppose you could look to a model like, you could look to Juan Perón, or Franco, or Salazar, some of those people. But you know, Pinochet was not some nationalist strongman leader like that. He was just an American flunky. He was just some loser. Junior
A
level
pawn for the
military
literal
officer.
IMF.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it would be like, I mean, it's like a step above below. Let's say somebody today said, yeah, my ideal head of state, Emmanuel Macron. That's like the man there. Angela Merkel. It's
I mean, someone I guess did vote for him, to be fair, but yeah,
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know where people get. I mean, like, I like General. I'm trying to stay away from the ideological superstructure. I like General Lee from everything I've read about him and as a person. Like, okay, this is like a good person. He predicted some things right about the American Empire, and just overall is an iconic figure. But like, well, I don't want to be ruled by him, but I like him as a historical figure. But to get into the, I've been looking at the South African court. I saw the various countries that actually said, okay, yes, finally, someone took Israel to court for genocide. My only problem is it's good, but it's highly symbolic. But what would you like to see, Keith, the global South also do? And I'm still trying to figure out exactly, because the global South is technically part of BRICS, but they technically have their own mentality, I would say, outside of BRICS. So, what would you like to see the global South do, like you're saying on X or Twitter or whatever the heck it's called, to completely stop that? I don't see them doing anything militarily.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I could
what I
see.
was all I was saying on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now is, as far as the genocide case that's being brought against Israel by South Africa, at the International Court of Justice, at the trial, there are 17 judges on their panel. Israel gets to pick one judge of their own, and South Africa gets to pick one. And then there are 15 others. Each of the five members of the Security Council, the UN Security Council, also has one judge. So that's America, Russia, China, France, and Britain. It's actually the American judge that's acting as the chief judge. Um, and of course, the concern that Norman Finkelstein and some other people have raised who've been observing this is that they're concerned that there's a built-in bias in the International Court of Justice because it's stacked with pro-Western judges or representatives of states that are aligned with the West. For example, Japan has a judge on the court, and so forth. Um, and a big determining factor, though, as to whether the court rules in South Africa's favor is going to be what the BRICS affiliated countries do, because China and Russia and Brazil, and I think India, I'm not sure about India, but let's see. I know at least Brazil, Russia, and China have um, judges on the ICJ. So the big question is, how are those judges going to vote? I mean, with Australia, the UK, the United States, we can predict how they're going to vote.
Yes.
The But there's a question of, well, how will Russia vote? How will China vote? And of course, something that Russia has to be concerned about is they're actually having genocide charges brought against them over Ukraine. China has been accused of genocide because of the Uyghur situation, and to a lesser degree, the Tibetan situation. So those countries may feel like they're opening themselves up to charges of genocide if they vote in favor of South Africa, even though South Africa is now a BRICS member. So that's something that's concerning about what the verdict of the ICJ would be. Now, the findings of the ICJ do matter. I mean, Israel is worried about this because as soon as the charges were filed by South Africa, Israel started pulling back its rhetoric and trying to lean on its international friends to try to provide additional cover for them and things like that. Because if a finding of genocide is brought against Israel, that can subject Israel legitimately to things like boycotts and sanctions and other things of that nature.
Yes.
Because, I mean, obviously, of course, as we know, the goal of the BDS movement is to put Israel in the same place as the former South Africa, the apartheid era South Africa, found itself in, where it was turned into an international pariah state, and to the point where there were trade sanctions against it, there were boycotts, there were everything from sports to academia to the arts, all kinds of boycotts on South Africa, and of course the pro-Palestinian movement is trying to pursue actions like that against Israel as well, and Israel, Israel has reason to be concerned about becoming an international pariah state on that level because that can affect their economy. It can affect things like visas. Like Israeli citizens can be denied visas to go to other countries. In some instances, government officials from Israel can be subject to arrest and brought before the International Criminal Court for war crimes and genocide trials. So it is something they're concerned about. They're not treating it as a non-issue.
Yeah. No, I've seen
but like
actual
it is a similar thing though, like because the U.S. will not join that court because if they did, then they would be tried for their like massive slate of war crimes, and it's the same reason that the U.S. and Ukraine, neither one of those countries would join the UN resolution recently to universally condemn Nazism, because that would involve accepting international jurisdiction, and it would also involve accepting that international jurisdiction over two countries which actively have historically and presently supported Nazis. So if you for instance are trying to wage a vassal war state in Ukraine, if you're trying to wage a war with a vassal state in Ukraine, is the sentence I meant to say, then you're gonna have to work with the Nazis in their military. And if you say you have to universally condemn Nazism, and then these people will be heavily incentivized to say fuck off, because this is the country that we've built. This is the country that we're working with. Our people love Strasser. Our people love the Azov battalion. They like Sieg Heiling, and they have fucking swastikas in their recruiting units. And so if you have that, so my point is, when these nations have fundamental at odds mentalities with this international model of justice and this international model of, they're not going to want to accept the verdict. If anything, if Israel gets accepted as an international war criminal, one of two things will happen. Either the ICC will become the subject of mass scrutiny and attack, or the Israeli state will be prosecuted none at all, because they can't, because the powers that be love AIPAC. The powers that be love the international Zionist state. They love using this place as a vassal and the arsenal of democracy, and they don't care about the genocides or the fact that these people are massively xenophobic, jingoistic, racist, whatever, what have you. The same way that they didn't care about, I think my internet's fucked up again. The same way that they didn't care about Ukraine being full of Nazis, because universally condemning Nazis, universally condemning genocide, that hits Israel and Ukraine in the same way. So you can't really. So my point is that the international power structure is resilient to this, and they're going to say to the ICC, yeah, they're genocidal fucks. They committed war crimes. They're using white phosphorus and bombing children. What are you going to do about it, bitch?
Yeah, although the situation with apartheid South Africa was very similar. The two countries that were probably the most adamant in their defense of the old South Africa were the United States and Israel. And those were the two countries that held out right till the very end, until apartheid fell. But it's also true that South Africa really did turn itself into an international pariah state in the process. And the external pressures were a big part of why that system fell eventually, as well as just losing legitimacy internally. I mean, Israel today has just become a total basket case internally. It's not the war in obviously the war in Gaza is the worst thing, and also they've opened new fronts in Lebanon and Yemen and all of that. But Israel proper is falling apart. I think Netanyahu's approval rating is something like 8%, which is very rare to have for a head of state to have an approval rating that low during the midst of a war.
Yeah, more people like Biden. I'm that's ridiculous to me. You could probably I haven't found anyone who likes him, but I'm sure. Well, actually, that's not true. I met some people like Biden, but
well, another thing is that Israel has the same internal culture war that we do. The one, between, say, the more conservative religious folks who are aligned with Netanyahu's party, and then between the more liberal pro-Western folks who tend to be aligned with the Mossad. So you have a big rivalry, a cultural rivalry, as well as a rivalry similar to, say, the deep state versus Donald Trump rivalry here in the United States. They have that in Israel proper. Also, Israel has used the war as a pretext for attacking its internal minorities as well. Like, there have been an upgrading of attacks on the ethnic Armenians, the non-Zionist Jews. There have been attacks on them, as well as Israeli Arabs, the Ethiopians. I mean, one thing about Israel is, a lot of people in the United States have this really naive view of Israel. They think it's just like Sweden in the Middle East or something like that. I mean, Israel is a fascist apartheid state with a racial and religious caste system, like the former South Africa, or like the Third Reich or India during the pre-Gandhi era, something like that. That's the kind of system Israel actually is. And then the elite of Israel are like the those of European Jewish ancestry, Ashkenazi or whatever. And whereas the Middle Eastern Jews, the Sephardics and the Mizraim, they tend to be more the working class. They're more like the proletariat, and then the Israeli Arabs, they're more like the Dalits or something like that. And then of course, Gaza is like the Warsaw Ghetto or something of that nature. So it's a very it's a very archaic, basically pre-enlightenment state model.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
well,
like also just in that regard, just gonna say, it's just like COVID, okay? And hear me out. It's just like COVID because right before COVID came out, there were protests in the street everywhere. There were protests in China, there were protests in France, there were protests in the US, there were protests in South America, there were protests fucking everywhere. Everybody started to hate the state. And then um suddenly something comes out where you got to stay indoors, and that thing is totally not created by Fauci in the US. It's absolutely not manufactured in a lab, and it's totally not a manufactured crisis that these people can use in order to force their agenda, right? Totally, absolutely never would insist that. So these things happened right as these protests kicked off. Well, there were a bunch of protests against Netanyahu and a bunch of the like establishment people in Israel, and suddenly an attack that they had advanced knowledge of, they did. This is proven. The BBC admits this. An attack that they had advanced knowledge of in the most advanced security state in the Middle East, with the most funding for the most like armaments toward like the Iron Dome, the stockpile, the arsenal of democracy, Western public, like private participation, like in Israel affairs, them cross training with troops and cops in America. Everybody knew this was coming. The intelligence was there. The intelligence was real. And then Biden unfreezes $6 billion to Iran, and wow, suddenly Hamas has money. And then like this happens, and the protests suddenly have to stop. Damn, we have to be a united country now. We've got to unite against these barbarians that are invading. And darn it, we can't protest
that we
anymore. Fuck
created
shucks.
that that we also to note that Bibi Netanyahu was admitted on the news. Yes, we created Hamas to be a counter. Well, not created, but funded Hamas, helped them get where they are to be a counter to Fatah,
Yeah.
Yasser Arafat, which that was before my time, but I still like read about it and stuff, and I learned who Menachem Begin was and Moshe Dayan and stuff like that. I guess the question going forward is I read what Aristotan actually was proposed by Gaddafi Jr., which is a Confederate state or a break off from, and I think and I was thinking like, okay, what's the best solution? Because I'm not a statist, so I'm not going to say a two-state solution anymore. I used to, but I don't think that's good. I think Aristotan's the logical conclude, the best thing that could happen, or otherwise, to me, it'll just be, hey, attacking here, attacking here, attacking here. I don't think that's gonna, I even read a U.S. classified report that came through and said if Israel they're having so much trouble now with just what's going on, if they fought Hezbollah, it would be or the Houthis. I don't think they'd be able to do it. So I think a breakaway state is the only way to get like the people who aren't insane on both sides to get any kind of peace. But I could be wrong.
Well, one idea that I've heard floated is comes from a guy named Rabbi Yakal Shapiro. He's a Jewish rabbi from the United States. He's an anti-Zionist Jew. He belongs to
Mhm.
one of sectarian groups of Judaism that considers Zionism to be heresy from the point of view of Judaism. But he was saying that region should just be called the Holy Land, and it should be there for Christians, Jews, Muslims, all of the religions that trace their roots to that area. And they could have something like a Swiss style system. Like in Switzerland, you have basically a federation of local communities. They call them cantons. And in Switzerland, you actually have different cantons for different language groups. Like some of them are Italian, some are French, some are German, and you could have that in the Holy Land or Greater Israel or whatever. You would have Christian and Jewish and Muslim and Druze and so forth. So sort of a localized system. And if they're going to have a national government, I suppose something like in Lebanon, they have what's called the confessional system, which means that in the national government of Lebanon, every sectarian group is entitled to a certain number of seats in parliament and a certain number of seats in the cabinet. The reason they set it up like that was that, of course, Lebanon had a bloody civil war for about 15 years. And afterwards, they were like, "Well, raw democracy, like 51% democracy, is not going to work because the majority is just going to vote to kill the minority. So they're going to have something where every group gets a voice, gets a representation in government. So that's how they do it. It's called a confessional system, and the Muslims, the Sunni, the Shia, the Alawites, and the Druze and the Christians and all of that get a certain number of seats each. But yeah, I mean, trying to have any kind of peace in Palestine now is going to be a problem just because of everything that's already happened. So I don't know how it would happen in the long run. It may be that they would need outside help, like in order to keep the peace, you might have to have a international peacekeeping force or something from different countries. Some Arab countries, some Western countries, that are the de facto military or police. Because if you have all Jewish police or all Palestinian police in a future Israelite or whatever, they might just end up fighting again. So it's a really really bad situation. I mean, it's one of the world situations that's the very worst in
Okay.
terms of.
Well, from a classical, well, okay, I guess and I agree with you. Um, well, two questions on the basis of my knowledge from Austrian economics and from the history of that region. The cantons actually, I think, would solve the problem of the Kurds, even though I don't like what some of the Kurds have done. Everybody's like, how do you help the Kurds? Well, here's your canton. Here's the thing. Like, to be fair, there are some groups that call themselves like my dad has told me what Berbers were, Bedouins, and I look at them like, are you just like, even Persians kind of look Arabic, although I don't. They probably wouldn't appreciate me saying that, but this is just my outward appearance. But I think we need a canton for the Kurds, and then the Kurds could be okay. Like, here's your canton, here's your representatives, here's your language centers, here's your thingies. Can you please chill out and stop doing that? And I think also if they have their canton, it should provide some kind of militia against Erdogan, who has been unfortunately persecuting the Kurds, which I don't like. The Turks doing that either. But I mean, France and Britain had 100 years war, and that wasn't an exaggeration. That was literally going back. Joan of Arc. They trade today, even though I know French who don't like British and British don't like French. And then there's more examples of that. It's not just Israelis and Palestinians, although we're talking about it. Russia's and Ukrainians don't. Like, I got an Uber driver from Ukraine in California. He said there's nothing good about Russians; they're all barbarians. And then I've heard Russians say the same thing about Ukrainians. And then obviously the Chinese and Japanese don't like each other. I think the Koreans don't like the Japanese, and then the Vietnamese don't like the Koreans or the Chinese or the Japanese. And even there's other groups with what happened with Milosevic, and then I guess like the Serbs don't like the Armenian and these groups, but they trade, and I've heard they're like even though there's hardline Zionists there are hardline Zionists who will trade with like members of Hezbollah, or members of, like, you can pick any. At least I wouldn't even doubt there's trading between these people before the blockade. If you establish trade, it doesn't mean you like the person, but it means you're willing to cordially get along with them enough to not murder them. Like, I think that's why Bastiat said, if goods don't go across borders, then soldiers will. If you, I don't want an internet, I don't want Egypt, because funny enough, I'm Egyptian and I see a lot of Egyptian people want to get involved, but CISO. But instead of having a peacekeeping force, what if you had just, I don't know, we send Austrians down or send somebody to help facilitate trade. If there's trade in Aristan, like if, oh, I'm buying hummus from the kibbutzes, and I'm buying uh, carpets, or I'm buying some olives and strawberries from these Palestinians. Do you think trade can, just because of those examples, Britain, France?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. In the long run, yeah, I think that's probably part of the solution. Although the idea of sending economic advisors in to help them develop trade something like that's probably going to get co-opted by the IMF, but that's another issue.
Yeah. Well, we can let, well, the dollar's on. Well, here's the thing. We got DeFi. To me, DeFi is on the way because I do videos at decentralized finance. So I think like cryptocurrency, more things that are coming against traditional finance. So to me, the answer to this is every other cultural group that's had odds, British and has, China and Japan, I'm sure do trade, even though they hate. So if we could just establish trade, and you know what? I would, even if the IMF gets involved, I would rather the IMF does some exploitation. I know I'm an anarchist and pluralist. I'd rather the IMF do a little exploitation and I don't have to open up X and say, oh, this kid got killed or this
Right.
dude got. Okay, well, there's a little bit of trade exploitation, but the Jews and the Arabs aren't killing each other. That's a pretty significant like thing. Like, okay, we're just trading now. We still hate them. I still don't like them. I still have beef with them. But I honestly feel then future generations come up and just learn about it. And like, oh, okay, I don't hate anybody anymore. We're trading. Life is good. Because that's what happened with the 100 Years' War. And the 100 Years' War, I mean, I guess this is 75 years, so we're getting close. But uh, if Britain and is there any reason to believe that Britain and France, even in the Middle Ages,
Wait, I mean, it's more than 75 years with the Israel-Palestine conflict. It goes back to mandatory Palestine and the violation of Sykes-Picot and the McMahon Hussein correspondence.
I'm traditionally going back to the Nakba, though. If I want to say like when this started in my opinion, when this, I mean like Sabotage Zevi came up
Why?
with because here's why I'm saying this, because the implementation of the idea came with Sabotage Zebi, when the Jews were getting killed in Europe, and then the Ottomans liked them, so they went to the Ottomans. But the real thing didn't happen after World War II until the Nakba happened. And I'd say that's when the real implementation of, like, I can talk about anarcho, but until I do a Murray Rothbard society,
They were already
actual
being
creation.
imported, though. They were already being like put there, and they were already like betrayed for their national independence. The like consequence of not being an independent nation is that they had to become onto the Western program, and that never changed. It's sort of like when, the transition state for alleged state communism failed because it became state capitalism. I don't see any reason to believe that the transition state wasn't the first domino to fall.
Okay.
I think that mandatory Palestine is the first step of this thing, and it's like over a century of conflict. What would you say to that, Keith?
I could be
Yeah,
wrong.
well, I think that the issue really goes back to the early Zionist settlements, and then the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Balfour Declaration, and all
Mm-hmm.
of that happened 30 years before the Nakba. Now the Nakba, really ramped things up a bit, obviously, but yeah, the roots of this problem go back a lot further than that, because there prior to the Nakba there had already been violence between Zionists and the Palestinian Arabs at that point as well. So yeah, I mean, it really starts, I think, with the development of Zionism as a colonial project, and then the alliance with Zionists between Zionists and the British government after World War One, when Britain assumed control of Palestine. That's where it seems to really have its roots.
Yeah, I could agree with that. Like, that it's hard because I don't have like a definitive starting point like there was violent, but I usually use the knockback because that's when things like really, really like escalated. Like, kind of like if you look at, like, I'm sure there was violence prior to the Trail. There's obviously violence before the Trail of Tears, but it was actually probably like, okay, well, there's a little bit of violence here, a little bit of violence here. This happened here, maybe at this settlement, but I, is there
But the
any reason?
moment the first treaty was broken with the natives, that was the bellwether. So
Correct. I'm
like
not. I'm
Jackson
not.
was way before the Trail of Tears, and that's why we have like Jacksonville. So
Yeah,
Alabama.
and I agree with you. I guess my question though is to ask if all these cultural groups with animosity to each other don't like each other, but still have trading now. Is there any reason to believe this situation's any different from that? Even though they took place in different time periods. I know the Hundred Years' War was medieval, and the Chinese and Japanese was over. Chiang Kai-shek was around the World War II era, but I don't see a fundamental difference in how it would work, other than maybe there'd be more technological things involved.
Well, I think you're right about that. I mean, there's plenty of examples of cultures that were in constant conflict with each other for a long time, where that's not really an issue today. Um, so, yeah, I think what you're talking about is certainly possible. It's not going to happen tomorrow, obviously, but in the very distant future, I could see that happening. Um, and I think a lot of it has to do with we were talking earlier about the cultural consensus. I mean, the reason Britain and England don't fight. I mean, the reason Britain and France don't fight anymore is simply because they've undergone a cultural shift. I mean, they're not the cultures anymore that are martial cultures where everything is just about the glory of the empire and
Mhm.
fighting, like war is an end unto itself, and that kind of stuff. I mean, they're still imperialistic in other ways,
Oh yeah,
but the martial culture of the Middle Ages isn't there anymore. And in the case of Israel and the Palestinians, I think that it's a similar situation. Some people have this idea that conflict goes back for thousands of years to antiquity, and it doesn't. There are Americans, for example, who think that this is just a continuation of the conflict between Israel and the Canaanites that's described in
Hmm.
the Old Testament. Which
no,
is not the case at all. This is something that's modern. This is a modern conflict. It goes back to maybe
Post
the late.
Ashkenazi.
Yeah, yeah. It goes back to the late 19th century. It's it's not something from antiquity. Um, and I think a lot of people in the United States don't realize that. But it's a fairly recent conflict. By world historical terms.
Yeah. Of course, those people worship politicians that were supported by APAC, so we know who they're bought by.
this is true. This is
I'm
true.
very I'm a cynical asshole. Like that's the way I think of everything. Is like the power connections and cui bono and shit. Like
I
they
mean,
pull the string. They got business cards. They come and fuck you up if you don't do it. They're like it's that
I,
sort of thing, and that's the reason. Like the Yemen conflict, the Yemen thing wouldn't even still be happening if the U.S. wasn't beholden to the House of Saud. Like the U.S. is beholden to foreign interests who control the oil in the countries that they're affiliated with, so that they can maintain petrodollar power. And like every bit of the power like that affiliates with these like big power like countries, those are the reasons that our politicians are bought. That's the reason Trump is associated with Live Golf. Like the dichotomy on an aesthetic level might be Trump versus the deep state, but Trump is the deep state. Like he always has been.
I
He's
agree.
very much affiliated with the big money, big fucking politics. And all these
Yeah,
people are bought by one group or another, like APAC, Saudis, the Russians, Ukrainians, Chinese, what have you. We're not an independent country and never have been. Like as far as back as the founding, the U.S. was beholden to the Dutch and French. That's the reason the Whiskey Rebellion was crushed. It's like fuck off anyone who thinks that this is the way we should proceed going forward. This sucks, asshole.
Yeah, well, and Trump was funded by Sheldon Adelson,
right,
who big
right.
time imperialist, all that stuff. I guess my question is, okay, so in response to this, I don't disagree with the Houthis that they just said, hey, look, you end the conflict, you allow supplies into civilians, and we'll stop grabbing vessels. And they kept doing that. Now, there's a lot of people who said the United States won't do anything. And I guess the United States, yesterday, out of all the problems in the United States, I guess Sleepy Joe and Dementia Joe and I don't even Austin think the most important thing to do is fight the Houthis in Yemen. I don't foresee, but they haven't stopped doing what they're doing, which is kind of funny. Um, I know there's some people with like the typical, authoritarian right American flag, like, look, we can take them down. Like you said, the Houthis would beat us. This is American military. But I honestly think what will happen is they'll carry out a couple strikes and they'll say, "Hey, stop doing it! Come on, please stop doing it." Because what I've noticed with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with modern conflicts, going into like maybe 2010, there you can use drones, so you no longer need $1 billion. But if you use a drone and you get it up to a ship, you guys can correct me if I'm, and it shoots a bunch of Scud missiles, that costs probably like $30 million or 20 or 10 million. It costs a lot of money. I don't know about that, maybe $3 million. But now the Houthis can use cheap drones, and they do have a lot of them. And the United States can just say, okay, well, we're going to do strike here, there, that. Um, I don't think the United States is going to be able to sustain, um, because this is literally if you consider them involved in it, it's literally a three-front war. They already lost, you, in my opinion. Ukraine's already lost, and then they want to get into another conflict. Do you foresee them being able to break down the Houthis, or actually do you think the Houthis are going to um, beat them in the long run? Not militarily, but they're just like, okay, you did a couple strikes. I don't care. We still got the ships. What are you gonna do? And Biden just like, I don't know. I'm sleepy.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that the U.S. is going to. I don't think things in the Middle East are going to turn out very well for the United States. They haven't so far. I mean, the
No.
United States was in Afghanistan for 20 years and lost, and has been in Iraq about the same amount of time and lost. You know, it was interesting because when September 11th happened back in 2001, in the month or so after that, before the actual war in Afghanistan started, I remember telling a lot of people that the United States is going to lose if they went to war in Afghanistan, and they were
Mm-hmm.
saying, you know, what are you talking about? The United States is a superpower. You know, we're going to lose. And I'm like, well, let's take a look at every power in history that ever tried to successfully occupy that region. Did it work for Alexander the Great? Did it work for Rome? Did it work for the British Empire? Did it work for the Soviet Union? There's no reason to think it's going to work for the United States. And you know, the United States will probably be in Afghanistan for a long time and then be driven out, and that's exactly what happened. And when the war in Iraq, the second war in Iraq in 2003 started, I used to tell folks, well, if you get rid of Saddam Hussein, all you're going to get is an insurgency by these Takfiri insurgent groups, and that's exactly what happened. That's how we got ISIS. And I used to say, if you create a parliamentary state in Iraq, who do you think would win an election? It would be the Shia. And what would be their political orientation? They would align themselves with Iran, and that's exactly what they've done. You know, so it's like the United States produced these outcomes for itself that were entirely predictable. You know, anybody who had even an elementary knowledge of that region could have predicted this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and from the point of view of the American ruling class, it wasn't in their interest that it turned out the way it did. You know, it's like they haven't been, well, I mean, I guess the wars were very profitable for the armaments industry, but as far as the geopolitical goals, you know, and it's certainly the United States has lost a lot of legitimacy and prestige along the way. And it's going to be the same way. I mean, if the United States and Israel try to go to war with the axis of resistance, well, that's going to be even worse. I mean, that's going to be like Afghanistan and Iraq all rolled into one.
A question: Are you, and just because I've heard people use that term, is the axis of resistance Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthi?
Yeah, it's Iran, Syria, Iraq, Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, uh, de facto the government of Lebanon, and then various other Palestinian and Iraqi non-state actors, um, like the MPLA and like the Shia militias in Iraq, or like the Islamic Jihad. All of that is under the axis of resistance umbrella, in which Iran is really the dominant and senior partner. And even though it's predominantly Shia, it's not exclusively Shia. You also have Christians, you have Druze, you have Sunni, you have secular leftists, Marxists involved in this.
You
But
know, it's crazy too, as well, Keith, because just an offshoot. I agree with some of what Iran's doing, but if I went to Iran, they'd kill me because um, I started looking after I read Alan Watts, who was around the time, like, oh, okay, I like mystical philosophy. It'd be great if Islam had this, does it? I'm like, what's a Sufi? I'm like, oh, okay, this is awesome. Like, I was raised Sunni, but they never taught me about these guys. These guys are really cool. Oh, Iran's persecuting them. Don't go there. Don't go to Saudi Arabia. They won't like that. So sorry.
Well, of all the predominantly Islamic countries in that region, Iran is probably not as bad as Saudi Arabia. Like
Oh yeah,
In Saudi Arabia, any other religion other than Wahhabi Islam is illegal.
yeah.
Um, it's illegal to be a Christian. It's illegal to be Jewish. I think you can maybe practice it in your bedroom or something, but other than that, you can't build a religious building like a church or a temple or a mosque for
No, no.
any other religion. And they're waging a war of persecution in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia against the Shia as well. Um, so Iran, see, as you know, in the tradition of Orthodox Islam, there is the concept known as the people of the book, which
Yes.
means that Jews, Christians, the Sabians, I think the Zoroastrians, some of the other proto monotheist religions um, are considered predecessors to Islam, sort of like a part of the evolutionary process before the prophet comes. Kind of the same way that Christians believe Judaism is sort of a predecessor to Christianity.
Mhm.
So if you really take Islam seriously, then you're supposed to have a certain degree of benevolence towards the people of the book. You're not supposed to persecute them and things like that.
Yeah.
And that's why in a lot of states historically that were organized as Islamic states, like the Ottoman Empire, for example, they had provisions for the people of the book to be able to practice some degree of self-rule or collective autonomy or at least have rights on some level, even if they were in a subordinate position. Like usually they were in a subordinate position. And Iran is like that. Iran does recognize Zoroastrians, Jews, and Christians as legitimate minorities, as people of the
They
book.
well, they do, but here's the weird thing. Here's the weird thing. Like obviously, on the side of be pro-Palestinian. I'm really pro peace, the conflict ending. I can understand why, like, I can support Iran's taking its oil, like Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams were talking about, taking its oil back from the U.S., opposing the
Mhm.
United States empire. I don't hate the U.S. I hate the United States empire. I can oppose them knocking down the neocon plans. That's great, and standing up to the psychopaths in the Knesset. Um, the interesting thing is though, I don't like them persecuting. I've read that they persecute the Sufis. I don't know. I'm
Well,
not willing to.
I mean, Iran doesn't have anything remotely approaching, like freedom of religion the way Americans understand
No,
it.
no.
And there are religious groups that are subject to persecution. The Baha'i are one. I think the Baha'i are one of the most persecuted
Hmm.
religious sectarian groups in Iran because they're viewed as Western. They're viewed, they're accused of being CIA and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, so there is religious oppression in Iran, but it's not quite on the level of say ISIS, where they'll try to forcibly convert people of other
No,
religions,
correct,
or
correct.
Saudi Arabia, where they literally ban any other religion other than their particular version of Sunni Islam, um, or at least there's a coterie of forms of Sunni Islam that are I think that are illegal in Saudi Arabia, but then you can't be anything else. Like Shia is banned, Christianity is banned, Judaism is banned.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting thing for me watching this. But I did read. I think it was your writer, Nikki Reed, or Comrade Hermit,
Yeah.
as they're called, and what we can learn from the Houthis. And it's kind of interesting to me because a lot of people argued for a very long time in the neocon time. Oh well, if you have 50 or seven, it's something ridiculous now, like 800 billion or $700 billion military budget, and you got a professional army, and you have all these fancy toys. That man, you're just going to be the beast. And I'm not saying that does nothing, but I am saying it's kind of interesting to see that hey, this ragtag group of Houthis, which just came from, you know, a pretty brutal war with Saudi Arabia, are still absolutely challenging world powers, and I'd say doing it rather effectively. Like Saudi Arabia doesn't want it, in my opinion, doesn't want anything to do with fighting the Houthis anymore. I think the United States, if I had to guess, is going to end up just like the French said, don't get involved in Vietnam, and we did anyway. I think the Saudis are probably going to say, hey, don't get involved in Yemen, same way, and history will not repeat itself but rhyme. Is that an incorrect analysis or no?
Yeah, well, I think I may have mentioned this the last time I was on your program, but before the recent incidents with the Houthis started, Ben Shapiro had a tweet where he was making fun of the Houthis, and he was saying, "Oh, they have the world's lowest GDP" or something like that. Basically saying, "Oh, what losers," But that just shows he doesn't understand warfare. People don't go to war for the GDP. There's never been an army in history that marched into battle saying, "Long live the GDP." People don't fight for the GDP. They fight for their sense of place, community, religion, culture, ideology, but they don't fight for the GDP. If you're relying on an army like that, you're pretty much going to lose from the onset because there's no profit in getting killed. So that's why the United States has performed so badly in some of these conflicts, fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, is because they're fighting people that are fighting for their sense of place, their sense of history, their religion in some instances, or their culture, or something that they think of as sacred or quasi-sacred. They're not just fighting because for pragmatic reasons, utilitarian reasons, cost benefit.
Like, they're paying for my call. Yeah, this is the problem. I think they're winning because incentives align to everything. So there's people like, oh, they're paying for my college, I don't want to be here, or there's I'm getting monetary thing from being a general or whatever it is. I'm going to be here, but if you're fighting against a force, regardless whether you think they're right, that's saying no, we want to fight because we believe. I do believe a lot of the Houthis are probably thinking like this is duty to a lot, because I know I've been in the Middle East. Like, we have an Islamic duty because just like Jews, because probably what the Houthis are saying, Palestinians are Muslim, we're Muslim. We owe it as part of the Ummah, as probably Bolson would say, to help them. And that's not something you're just like, oh, well, he gave me more, he increased my salary by 10 grand, so I guess I'll forget about the Ummah. Like, hey, do you want to forget about the
when the Iraq War in 2003 started, that same month, I was in Europe at the time, and I was staying in a hotel in Amsterdam. And I remember one day I was sitting in the lounge of the hotel, and CNN International was on, and they were showing footage of U.S. troops going into Iraq, and they had embedded journalists there with them that were filming this. And there were also embedded journalists in Iraq itself, that were with these Iraqi militias preparing for the invasion. And I noticed there was a sharp contrast between the two sides. Like the Iraqi people, they were like, yeah, let's fight, we're for God and country, or whatever they think they're fighting for. Whereas the American troops, they just had this look of like, how did I get myself into this?
Yeah.
They
My
didn't
recruiter didn't tell me.
Yeah, at the recruiting center, they didn't tell me about this part, so I was like, yeah, I know who's going to win this,
I got free college. But the problem is, I think, you get people like, okay, free college, they have no motivation. Then you get people like the neocons, like, and also people like, maybe even Shapiro, or all these people like, we have advanced technology, so we won. I'm like, that doesn't work like that. You can do that all you want. If you can have the most advanced technology, and I've seen this with people, that even generals in the United States are like, what are you doing? Like even Colonel Douglas McGregor, like, okay, we just spend a whole bunch of money in advanced technology, and then a $2,000 homemade rocket destroys a Merkava tank that's worth 100 million. They're like, how did how did the Merkava tank get destroyed? And I'm like, well, it's because you have bad tactics and you have tanks going in with no infantry. I'm not a war buff, but I listen to them, and I play real time strategy games. I know that doesn't count, but I listen to people who are experienced on war, and they say like, hey, you send a Merkava tank in there, it gets blown up by a $2,000 or $100 missile, then eventually what will happen is you'll just bankrupt yourself, and you won't be able to sustain it, because it's not like you can just build another Merkava tank or another Abrams in a day. Like, oh man, I think the United States lost a bunch of military equipment in Ukraine. It's actually kind of funny. I don't know which one I like more. Um, Joe Biden's failures or Donald Trump's successes. It's kind of funny. The one good thing Biden did is he's destroying. He's getting a lot of military hardware on America destroyed by
Uh,
bad.
See, but here's the thing. No, he's sending the terrible hardware over there, and he's getting rid of that so that he has pretext for more spending on the military-industrial complex. And the entire world relies on the American military-industrial complex. They all get their stuff made here. If you look into how the world funded their arms that they donated to Ukraine, they all funded it through the U.S. military-industrial complex. That's the reason that even looking at just the amount that the U.S. sent over there wasn't enough. You have to look at how much the U.S. made off all of the purchases of U.S. military hardware and all the taxation that they recuperated from those sales and transfers, even if it's a foreign nation allegedly funding it, especially since those foreign nations got where they are based on U.S. spending. It's one giant capital market, and getting rid of some shit hardware that the U.S. doesn't need anymore is very much the same as Russia getting rid of like the inexperienced fighters first or their bad hardware first. They'll always do that. And now, hey, Israel's saying we need to replenish our arsenal of democracy. And suddenly there's a war there that they knew everything about in advance, but totally, didn't stop for a good reason. And that totally good reason is truly stopping the genocide of the Israeli people and not getting better weapons that they can replenish their arsenal of democracy with. It's absolutely not a conspiracy. They
Huh.
aren't being cynical manipulators of markets or driving the military industrial complex. That would be wrong. They're perfect and innocent angels. So
Yeah.
instead of thinking that maybe the US is doing the right thing and getting rid of a bunch of hardware and breaking down its own, realize that the stuff that the US gives to other people isn't the gold-plated flashy fancy new stuff. It's the stuff that they can get rid of without losing military power.
Okay. I could be wrong on that. Again, um, more on the philosophical side of anarchy. I'm not a military guy. I just listen to Colonel Douglas McGregor in the background while I'm working on stuff. But yeah, that's one thing I want to um, keep seeing is like, hey, does the U.S. want to lose I guess, or have another defeat against the Houthis, because the Houthis are very, very determined, and they've been battle hardened. Um, and I'm hoping what eventually happens is the U.S. is like, at some point wakes up and says, we're a dying empire, we're out. And when I think that happens, I think things will get better in the region. I'm hoping. Um, this empire is taking a long time to die, though, which is my only issue. Um, so,
Well, I think that it's going to go the same way as the British Empire. It's going to die gradually. The world order we're moving into is very similar to the world of 1900, where instead of having a unipolar hegemonic superpower like the United States in the post-Cold War period, or having a bipolar world order like in the Cold War, around 1900, we had a world of maybe a dozen or so major powers, and the British Empire was still the largest player on the field, but they weren't the only player on the field. And I think
mhm,
the United States is becoming kind of like what the British Empire was in 1900. It was an empire that was starting to decline. It was still the biggest player on the field, but you had all these other rising powers that could challenge it. Back then, and some of the same ones. Like back then, you had France had the French Empire was probably the second biggest empire at the time. If any state has assumed that role today, it would be China. Russia, ironically, is very similar to what they were in 1900. They're a regional empire, but one that doesn't have the kind of long reach that the Soviet Union had. And then you see other powers that are rising. You see Turkey rising. You see Indonesia, India, Southeast Asian countries are really growing very rapidly economically. Latin America, you've got Brazil. Africa is rising as well. Yeah, I think we're moving more into this kind of world of multipolarity, definitely.
I think that might be good. What I'm determined to do, and since my dad and other people challenged me on it, especially since I've been bringing up the respectable General Lee, not from an ideological superstructure. I like him as a historical figure, but I started saying like, look, the best thing for America if we want to maintain our standard of living and everything like that is we need to just say state secession at this point. Same with the European Union. I think European Union needs to go. The United Kingdom doesn't need to be united. I don't consider that progress. I would prefer these things break away. We just break away, and maybe countries that like each other work with each other and be like, hey, I want to work. Pennsylvania wants to work with, I could see New York or New Hampshire. That's great. Texas wants to work with Arkansas or Mexico. Maybe Texas, if they seceded, would fix their border problem because they could just deal with it there. And I think secession would be the best thing right now. Individual states seceding or even blocks seceding would be nice. And I think that's something we need to push for. I don't agree with Tim Poulon a lot. He's a commentator, if you're familiar, but but I'll say this: if you look at the political compass, which is deeply flawed, me and Jeremy would be the whole bottom strip. But you have people like John Podesta who would be authoritarian left, if I can call him that. And he said if Donald Trump won in 2020, the whole Midwest should secede. And I was like, I agree. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene, who like believes in a lot of crazy Alex. Well, I like Alex Jones, but a lot of crazy QAnon stuff. Sorry, she says, "Oh, well, she was trying to put some secession things in." Then I seen Michael Malice mocking this like guy with a Doge thing with like a Ukrainian and Israeli flag and a NATO flag, saying, "Oh my God, if Texas seceded, we'd lose military bases." I'm like, and he said, "Cry harder," and I'm like, ooh, secession's on the table. And even when I talk to normal Trump supporters or Americans, I'm like, what do you think of secession? They're like, oh, we'd have different armies and stuff like that. Would that be okay? I'm like, yeah. So I think secession is on the table. We just need to get it in a bill and do it. Am I wrong or right?
Yeah, increasingly, I see public opinion polls that show that sympathy for that idea is growing. I've seen some opinion polls that show something like 40% of the US population is at least casually sympathetic to the idea. And it tends to cut across the spectrum. I mean, you have some people on the left, right, middle who favor this. I think it depends on whether you have who the president is at any one time. If it's a Republican president, sympathy for secession on the left goes up. If it's a
Yes.
Democratic president, it's the reverse. But it's still pretty consistent across the board, though, in terms of the actual numbers. It's it's about 40% last I started checking public opinion polls, and
But that's really high. You said 1 in 4 Americans in your book. So I'm like, all right.
no,
I
that was written back in the late 2000s. That was written back around 2008. It's a lot higher than that now.
It's a lot higher now. So in my opinion, people actually know the solution. They have it there. We got the works of Rothbard, Kropotkin, Bakunin. Zerzan is still alive, which is good. We have the works of Huxley for the anarcho, technical anarchists or all that. So we got all the frameworks ready. We have customary law, like you can look up now what Gaelic law, what Brehon law is, what Zir is, what all this stuff, common law. People are getting more versed in that. So I think now, if we don't want to have uh, people have argued with me America could become a second world country like Mexico. And I said, well, you can prevent that if you secede and take care of stuff in your own state, your monetary policy and all that type of stuff. And the also added benefit to the world is, okay, if Pennsylvania, it's its own nation, or you said if Ohio, it's its own nation, we're not going to go to war with Iraq. Whoa, whoa, whoa. We don't want our dollars going to fund war with the Houthis or war or what's going on with Israel and Palestine. No, we don't want to fund Ukraine or Russia's thing. I think secession is the only way to legitimately save A, the world, and B, our diminishing standard of living. That's my analysis. That's why I was a fan of Generally Lee in spirit, because I could use him as an icon. I even was reading your book. Last thing I'll say, you said call it the Federalist Party when those anarchists get together. I don't think they'd like it because it reminds of federal government. I said, what's a good anarchist name? And I looked at the general. I'm like, what did he name his horse? Okay, we'll call it the Traveler Party, and we'll start. Because I do like him. And I'm like, okay, I'll start. I'll talk to the Mises guys, the Mises boys, and be like, let's rename it. Let me talk to the leftists who are anarchists. Let me talk to the primies. Let me keep making podcasts and eventually raise enough money to run. And I told my dad, you know what, you make jokes now, but give me a few years. Let me find a way to make a bunch of money online through YouTube and Amazon and automation and drop shipping. And I will pull I'll find a way. If I have to run or fight the governor, I'll find a way to pull PA out of the union, because I don't want to go through a dying empire phase, and I don't want my money to go to genocide.
Right.
Am I unreasonable in any of those?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the situation in Israel is particularly bad. I mean, it's we're dealing with. I mean, Israel has gone full Third Reich at this point.
Yes.
And the United States is complicit in it. In fact, I believe I saw today that South Africa was contemplating bringing charges against the United States as well for.
Yeah, they should.
Good. Fuck AFRICOM.
Yeah.
But you know what the problem is with the United States? Like I actually told one person, like, what do you think of the United States? I like living here, but I have a problem with the U part. That my issue with the United States is the United part.
Yeah.
I really agree with that. And you even
my issue is the state part.
Well, me and Jeremy have had this debate, and we can close off with that. I said, Jeremy, look, this is not perfect. And I was talking to Jeremy and his friend BT, which if you're on Discord, Keith, I'd love to have you in the server. Considering you're the best contemporary thinker on all forms of anarchism, would be awesome. But I was arguing with him and BT. I said, look, let's go back to the Articles of Confederation, and then you can figure out your anarchist societies from there. And the Articles are not perfect. It's still status, but it's a lot better than what we got now. I don't know what, and I get it. There's an ideological superstructure behind the Articles of Confederation, but I think from just a standpoint of like, hey, this would work better. I am an Articles of Confederation type of guy. When I read that,
we got done with like a whole lot of like anti-slavery talk, and now we're talking to going back before the amendment against it. So that's a great idea. Good for that.
No. I'm not okay, and I'm not pro-slavery. I'm against all taxes, including sales tax. I've argued no sales tax with libertarians, but I am arguing that we either have a limited federal government, or the Articles of Confederation would have been better because the United States would have not have the expansion it would have. They would not got involved in World War I. That's theoretical, but the Articles of Confederation just limit federal power, and I think if we're going to do anything practical,
we should not go back to a more limited form of government, because every smallest government turns into the largest government with the cultural vestiges of freedom and liberty. And we should just realize the fact that there is no successful transition state to anarchy, and it didn't work with the communists. It won't work here. It didn't work in the U.S. The U.S. is a failed experiment, if it ever was an experiment, to a free country.
Okay. I would say, because things happen progressively, like you have a pull-up bar, you do pull-ups, you're not going to do 100 and what, but you're not going to do CrossFit CrossFit Murph in a day. Just like that, I don't think you're going to go from what we have from Dementia Joe or Mango Mussolini to ANCAP stand. What we can do is say, hey, let's reduce this. Oh, that's okay. The world didn't end. We got rid of Social Security. The world didn't end. Oh, we privatized the police. The world didn't end. Let's take it a
How
little
are we
further.
going to reduce this? Are you suggesting a political solution? Because that never works. It didn't work, and it will never work. We need anarchist solutions. We need people to actually manually do this stuff and prove that it works. That's what I said in the beginning of the stream, and I stand by it.
But okay, I believe in local elections. I believe in running in local office. I believe in running for your state government if you can, winning.
Lots of belief there.
Fair enough, but I'm part of the Mises Caucus. I didn't join the Mises Caucus to not take political action. I don't know, Keith.
I'm a hedgehog. I'm a hedgehog to go fast and get this over with.
I get.
Yeah, well, I think that if anarchist ideas started becoming more pervasive, I think you would see people trying a lot of different angles, some of which would be more successful than others. But I think some people would try an agorist approach, some would try a secessionist approach, and some would try a reformist approach, and you'd probably have people doing all kinds of wacky stuff too. And I guess maybe through the process of natural selection, something would turn out to be the best method. Then maybe people would coalesce around that.
What if it turned out to be anarcho-monarchism? Like, hey, we have a king. Who's your king? I don't know who he is, but everybody's scared of him, so they're all in line. I'm like,
well, I guess all of my Catholic libertarian friends would be happy with that.
Well, and I could say the same thing. Like, what if it turned out to be anarcho-Epsteinism, and you just get blackmail on all of these people, and that prevents them from getting corrupt? No, in fact, that wouldn't happen. Let's not do absurd hypotheticals.
All right, fair enough. Honestly, I think, to be fair, the most prosperous societies, if I had to guess, would be the Hoppian or the Rothbardian societies, and then it would be the syndicalists, then it would be the ANCOMs working there.
Yeah, because
but I like the idea.
Removing all dissenters is definitely a good way to get the anarchist result. That would definitely be the most prosperous society in an anarchist context, I'm sure.
I don't know what it would be. To be fair, I think also the Prodonian societies of mutual aid, it'd be interesting to see how mutual aid would work in today's society, because you have Cash App, you have Venmo, you have different things. So like, hey, I have a disaster, boom, 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 mutual aid. So I think that'll be interesting.
I'll just say this. Any society that says crush the anti-fascist mob is going to fail anarchy. And it already fails because that's already what Hans Hermann Hoppe and his followers are talking about, crushing the anti-fascist mob. That's what the Rothbardians were talking about, unleashing the cops and crushing,
Okay, call it what? How about this? Let's lose the names. In Keith's book, which I've been looking through, let's say one. Forget names. Forget names. Let's drop all the names. I'm sure there would be this people who are like, man, my private property. All right, go create a community of all private property and your gated thing and see how it works. Not fighting any, just private property exclusive. Okay, I want a syndicalist type community like the Zapatistas. Okay, let's see how that works. Okay, I want an ANCOM community based on like communal ownership. Okay, I don't like any of this stuff. You guys use too much of these. Let's try more primitivists. Okay, let's see how that works. And then pluralists like us could go, okay, I see this society, because everybody would be biased towards their thing. So pluralists could do like sociologists. Sure. Okay, this is working.
What I suggest is this, and it's a simple proposition. Never stick to any idea involving a name. Never, ever be a Rothbardian or a Hoppian or a Prodonian or a Marxist or anything like that. Follow an idea, and if the idea, like its natural and reasonable and ethical conclusions diverge from a thinker who proposed it, then diverge from that thinker in pursuit of a purer form of that idea. It's a much better way to think than following some leader off a cliff, which is what happens inevitably every single time these things happen. We always have to ask, well, what would this person say about that? Fuck that person. If they're wrong, they're wrong. So I say follow principle, and principle says as long as it's anarchy, as long as you're not imposing it on other people, that's the ideal solution. So I'm sure that Keith would agree with that.
Yeah, very much.
Be a Prestonian.
Yeah, I don't know about
Nope.
that. It's
The
well, I mean,
the
I
only
agree with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky said years ago that anything with a person's name on it belongs to the history of organized religion. It's
Mhm.
and he said that would include someone calling themselves Chomskyan. So yeah, so I'd have to agree with that. It's like any idea that becomes a cult, it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only
Okay. So
cult that will ever matter, the only cult that will ever render freedom is the cult of speed.
we call it, or Blue Oyster Cult because they're a good band. But yeah, I really like the chapter, why I'm an anarcho pluralist, and I was just saying that because he names a bunch of stuff. But yeah, let's get it down to in my opinion, get down to the state first, and then down to the village level, and then see how these different villages work from there. Also, uh, sorry, this is the last thing I'll say. It'll be interesting to see, like, it, keep in mind there'd be different customary laws as well. Asia does not think, people in Asia do not think like us. People in Russia do not think like us. Like I said before, I and we cultures. How does a ANCOM society in the United States work versus one in St. Petersburg? And how does that differ from what happens in Beijing? And how does that differ from an Israeli kibbutz society? And how does that differ from an Islamic society? Okay, how does that? Oh, there's individual anarchists there. How did individual anarchists, I think, suspect in America and Canada, would act very different than individual anarchists per se in uh, the Netherlands, or per se in Sweden because of certain things, or say even in um, African countries. It would have different motivations and different incentives. And that's also something I think sociologists take a look at. Like under uh, Sharia law, if a community has Sharia law, can you effectively have somebody who is pro Sterner? I think you could, but the operations and the incentives and the way you'd have to move in that from day to day would be different. So I'll close it off with that. But that's something I'd be curious also to see geographically. How do these frames work with anarcho-communism, all that, work with different sociological aspects, and then how do they work with individual aspects? And I'll stop from there. Sorry if I overanalyzed this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I do think the cultural paradigm in which a particular type of anarchism evolves is important. For example, Spanish anarchism emerged out of the Catholic peasant culture of Spain. And I think one reason why it developed and became as large as it did is because it was a substitute for the Catholic Church. Because Catholicism had always been such a deeply ingrained part of Spanish culture, you had a lot of people, among the poor peasantry of Spain had become alienated from the church because the church always sided with the ruling class. So I think anarchism in many ways became a substitute Catholicism. And it was interesting to go back and look at some of the social norms that developed within Spanish anarchism. They had their own type of anarchist Puritanism. Some of them did not believe in smoking or drinking or that kind of stuff. Some of them did not believe in eating meat. They viewed it as bourgeois decadence. Also, because they were so alienated from the Catholic Church, they would refuse to have anything to do with religious ceremonies. Like I read once about an anarchist woman in Spain who refused to go to her son's funeral because it was in a Catholic church. Um, in fact, they would not use some of them would not use any swear words that had a religious connotation. Like they would not say the word God out loud, not because they didn't want to be sacrilegious, but because they didn't want to be religious.
Yeah.
They were almost like Southern Baptists or Orthodox Jews or something in their
Yeah.
in their religious Puritanism, but it was an anti-religious Puritanism.
It's kind of funny if you look at like you have the best all right. If you look at Dr. Leeson's analysis of Caribbean pirates, which I get, these are pirates, they're predicated on theft. I get it. But like, if you look at how they structured things, you're like, oh, they're a bunch of rowdy dude just smoking and drinking and like shooting cannonballs at people. That's completely not true. That to have a cohesive, even criminal organization, they had stuff like, okay, no, drinking or smoking, after this. Don't have women, up on the deck after this time. Don't have this. Don't have this. And almost when you look at this, like after he analyzed all the rules of 18th century pirates, it became almost like your church club or your Puritan thing, where it's like, whoa, these anarchists are just crazy. It's actually like, wait, no, they're more disciplined than actually some of these people who claim to be tradcons in conservative Inc.,
And
which are
I've made the point many times, especially to leftists who like oftentimes have like heavy drug and alcohol influences in their lives. Marx said religion is the opium of the people. You know what else is opium? Opium.
open.
And maybe if
Yeah.
we're going to try to avoid things that are going to break your brain, like religion, you should also avoid things that break your brain physically and chemically and push you onto a dependence cycle and make you beholden to your pusher and et cetera, et cetera. Like the idea that anarchists should be on drugs is one of the worst possible things. We should have clear minds. We should be strong and healthy and able to fight these fuckers off. And hey, if we can do that long enough and consistently enough to not follow cults of personality and weird names and stupid circle jerks, maybe the Libertarian Party could become the party of principle for once.
Yeah. Well, hey, you could always come up with your own thing. So I'm down with that. And last thing I'll say, Keith, really, really appreciate you coming on and discussing all these things.
Yeah,
Um,
anytime.
and unfortunately, I cannot make it to because I have a job on the weekend, and I said I'd help them. I can't make it to the March for Gaza, but I will make it to defeat the deep state. But definitely, um, this is going to be an amazing event. So go to March on Washington for Gaza. It's going to be at the National Mall, 1600 Constitution Ave. And you can check out Attack the System here. I do appreciate Keith put up our discussion as well. In addition, me and Jeremiah started a new project with people from all different types of schools, Anarch Unity. And some of the really good ones are the ones that Jeremiah's wrote, Funding of Freedom, Jeremy Kaufman. I wrote What is Anarchy? Okay. And then also we have Anarcho Unity and its necessity and on the question of anarchy. So check out Anarcho Unity. We have some articles and we will have some videos up soon. Also, there will be ways to support our work. And you can also find Jeremiah at Insanity is free on YouTube as well. Damn it.
Well, not on YouTube. That's Jeremiah Talks. I'm Insanity is free on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else. On YouTube, I'm Jeremiah Talks, and you can also find my work at the Free Thought Project and agorasnexus.com.
All right. And with that, definitely another amazing episode, another amazing discussion. Going to have this up as soon as I can edit it and get description tags, all that fun stuff, and then I'll share it out to people and convert more people to anarchy. Because I need a secessionist pack, to help me pull PA out of the union.
Pennsylvania, surrounded on all sides by Yankees. That'll be a good one.
All right. Well, I'll debate this off camera. But all right, everyone. I want to give a big thank you to Keith Preston from Attack the System, Insanity is Free from Anarch Unity, and the Free Thought Project and Agora Nexus. And we will catch you next time.